Stay in it, remain, before the summer is over. And before the politicians get to dominate the debate, there's one taking place amongst eminent historians. The Emeritus Research Professor at the LSE, London School of Economics, is Professor Gwythian Prins, and he argues that both Europe and Britain are haunted by ghosts, which are clouding their judgment about our proper future. He joins me in the studio now, along with Professor Margaret Macmillan, Professor of International History, joins us on the line from Oxford. Morning to both of you.
Good morning.
Let's first of all just identify, if we could, Professor Prins, what are these two ghosts you're referring to?
The ghosts are the long-established ghost of the British fear of decline. It's something which has marked the British elite, particularly since Suez. And the European ghost is the terrified fear of the return of war, which has caused people to argue that the European Union has, in some way, which history doesn't support, been the cause of the prevention of the return of war since the Second World War.
Well, let's, if we may, take them one at a time. Just get you to spell out the first in a little bit more detail. It has often been said, yes, that Britain is in decline, that we'd lost an empire and had yet to find a role, and therefore it's often been argued that the EU, the European Union, the common market as it was, is our future necessarily.
Yes, that was the argument that was made 40 years ago. I'm old enough, you're just old enough to remember when the question was put. And at that time, the spectre of decline seemed to be plausible. But of course, it is no longer. The Foreign Office Scotland report, which was produced just before the referendum, makes quite correctly the point that Britain is now a rising power. We are, in the Foreign Office's words, a soft power, superpower. We also have better growth opportunities. We have far greater institutional links across the world than any other European power. And we must not allow ourselves to be dominated by the ghost. And this is the point of Beyond the Ghost, the essay I've written, which, by the way, listeners can download from the Historians for Britain website this morning.
We'll put it up on Twitter as well. Let's get Professor Macmillan to respond to ghost number one then, Professor Macmillan, that it is wrong to say that Britain is in decline and therefore, as it were, needs to cling on to Europe to ensure we're not.
Well, if Britain is not in decline, I don't really know what the indicators are that it's rising. I mean, the Foreign Office would say that it's a soft power, superpower, but soft power is something that's very hard to measure. And the idea that Britain has links around the world, I come from Canada. You know, Britain was once very important to us. It isn't anymore. We don't have that much trade with it. We don't have many immigrants from Britain. We don't have those family ties that used to exist. I don't think the United States considers Britain as that important. I mean, people talk about the special relationship, but it's more talk in Britain than it is in the United States. So I'm not sure I'd agree with Professor Prins that the United Kingdom is a power in its ascendancy.
Well, let's get him to respond. Professor Prins, are you merely looking back to the days of the Commonwealth, or are you arguing that we can be a sort of Hong Kong of Europe, off the coast of Europe, being a sort of buccaneering, pioneering nation?
Well, I would call in my support the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the first instance, because I think Professor Macmillan, I understand that she may hold that view, but of course if you go to India, if you go to the rising parts of the world economy, which are part of the Commonwealth, which of course was treated atrociously when we last left. But one of our great opportunities now is that we are, thanks to Her Majesty the Queen, in a position to revive our relationships with the Commonwealth, and that is where the future lies. It is the EU that is in genuine decline. It is a failing project.
Let's go on to, if we could, before I get you to respond, Professor Macmillan, to Ghost 2. Now, what is being argued is that the Europeans, the rest of Europe, Professor Macmillan, are too obsessed with avoiding war, and in a sense that is in the past. We need to worry less about it and get on with the future.
But I think there's something in that. I mean, I think the Europeans were very conscious when they began to talk about the European common market, the steel and coal community, and then the European Union, of what war had done to Europe in the 20th century. And those memories have faded. We now have generations that don't remember the Second World War, and certainly none that remember the First World War. But I do think there are other reasons why the EU should be looking ahead rather than looking back. I mean, I think it has been successful on other levels, and I would argue that it has played a part in making Europe a continent much less likely to have war.
Professor Prins, when you look at some of the tensions, for example, that we're seeing over border issues and migration, wouldn't it be that much more dangerous if there was not some sort of place where European leaders met to sort them out?
Well, of course, and we do have exactly those places because on positive historical evidence, not on supposition, we know what has kept peace in Europe and in the wider world since 1945. It was the Marshall Plan which helped the Germans to reinstitute themselves. It, of course, has been NATO and the wider alliance, which is dominated by the Anglosphere, of which, of course, Canada is a prominent member, which keeps us safe from the threats of today, whether it's Mr. Putin or whether it's the Daesh.
The underlying question, I suppose, here, Professor Macmillan, and you are the sort of people who have this breadth of perspective, is the EU the future, or could it be history? Could it be a project that lasts just a matter of a few decades rather than centuries?
Oh, I think historians are very bad at predictions, and, we talk about positive historical evidence. We can all find all sorts of evidence to back our arguments. I don't think the EU is finished yet. I think it clearly is in need of reform. I think that's a matter for members of the EU to decide themselves.
Okay.
But I would be reluctant to write it off.
Professor Prins, a final brief word, if you would.
The EU was the future once.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.